All right, so thank you for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be here. Super humbling. I think this is the first time that I've spoken on a panel where I'm the only one who does not have my own Wikipedia page, so that's kind of interesting. And if I wasn't nervous to begin with this morning, I happened to turn on Democracy Now! No, but that was a great interview. My name is Kartik. I'm the energy planner with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. We're a citywide alliance of grassroots organizations that serve New York City's most environmentally overburdened communities. In the context of the United States and most of the West, if not throughout the world, the most environmentally overburdened communities are typically low-income communities and communities of color. And I guess just a quick, brief introduction to the founding of our organization and what exactly our purpose is. So more than a quarter century ago, the current members of our alliance, which are grassroots organizations spread out throughout the city, 4 boroughs, Staten Island, but sort of started to realize that whatever their local environmental justice fight was, whether it was the disproportionate siting of highways or wastewater treatment plants, power plants, waste management, their local struggles had structural underpinnings. And the purpose of the Alliance is to coalesce our members around advocating in ways that directly address those structural underpinnings, regardless of what theme of the environment we're talking about, and really get at the root causes and design ways in which we can facilitate fundamental transformation in terms of how we relate to the urban environment. Cool. Thank you so much. So here's a map of where our members are and their geographic distribution. We currently have 10 members of NEJA, again spread across 4 boroughs. And while this presentation is going to be sort of New York centric, I hope what I implicitly do throughout the course of the presentation is present you with sort of an epistemic argument for how we should see and come to know the city or cities in the current context we're in, with climate change as well as unprecedented levels of urbanization, and also present to you a form of practice, specifically urban practice, in terms of how to apply ourselves in relation to each other and in relation to the built environment, economic processes, politics, etc., in order to facilitate fundamental transformation in the ways that we want to see happen. So both a form of seeing and knowing and knowledge production, as well as the application of knowledge in the form of practice. The two are obviously not necessarily distinct from each other. So before I go to the next slide, which is going to be a map that I will walk you through because it's got a lot of information, but I just want you to keep in mind what the spatial distribution of points are in relation to the images that you're about to see. So where our members are and where our communities are. So this first map, I'm going to stand up very briefly. These solid lines are areas that the city has designated as what are called significant maritime industrial areas, or SMIAs. And SMIAs are basically where the city has deemed appropriate for land use purposes, the siting of heavy industrial activities, right? So whether it's particular activities like auto body shops, or whether it's the storage of hazardous materials like oil containment, these areas of the city have the industrial character in order to host these types of activities, right? Now, when you overlay it with income data, you can see that these areas are disproportionately low income. If you overlay this area with, and the dotted lines are half-mile buffer zones. If you overlay these areas with data on distributions of populations of color, you can see that there are disproportionately communities of color. Now, that's sort of a social and economic overlay. Now we'll look at some of the environmental conditions. When you look at storm surge data and where the flood inundation areas of the city, you can see that the SMIAs are disproportionately vulnerable to storm surges during extreme weather events related to water activities, I suppose. So what this means is you have areas heavily concentrated for activities that produce hazardous and toxic materials that are also at the same time disproportionately vulnerable to toxic exposures of those very same materials in the era of climate change. This disproportionate vulnerability is falling upon populations that are already disproportionately vulnerable to these exposures and to environmental harms. Now, in relation to heat vulnerability, here's a map of heat vulnerability. The more red you are, I guess, the more heat vulnerable you are. Now, how this relates to SMIAs is for those, I would hope all of you might know New York City to some degree, those of you who live here, but the area of sort of Williamsburg, Bushwick, you start to notice sort of like a situation of compounding crises at play here and compounding vulnerabilities. So not only do you have vulnerabilities to toxic exposure from storm inundation, but it's one of the most heat vulnerable areas in the city. You might be wondering what that solid black line is. That's an area that Con Edison, the utility here, has projected an energy shortfall. And if you look at the heat data and where the energy shortfall is, they overlap almost symmetrically. So one of the most heat vulnerable areas in the city is also projected to experience an energy shortfall, and a significant portion of that area is also vulnerable to toxic exposure during extreme weather events such as hurricanes. So, another added layer to this sort of presentation of the climate crisis in a way that's important to understanding, which is that it's, again, the overlaying of multiple forms of crises that are manifested materially through legacies of environmental racism, economic injustice, that are manifested within the built environment, the constitution of the built environment. And so this is like a story about Brooklyn. I'm going to zoom in, but there's also, during the discussion, if we have time, the other heat vulnerable area of the city, the Bronx up there, there's another story there that I can go into as well, and what the multi-layered forms of crises and vulnerability are there. So if we zoom in, again, you can sort of see what the vulnerabilities are to storm surges. The heat data has been taken out. The top SMIA there, letter B, that's Newtown Creek, which has experienced an oil spill only rivaled by Deepwater Horizon. And we have members in that area, right? And some people might say, well, this is a gentrifying area, which is very true, but at the same time, gentrification only adds even more of an experience of crisis for long-term residents who are experiencing environmental pressures, but now are experiencing pressures of displacement. The dots are public facilities, and they're categorized by color based on how solar ready they are. So green means that there's a solar project underway on top of this public city-owned facility. Yellow means that it's a solar ready building, so the city could build a project there if they wanted to, and gray means that it's not solar ready. So this argument not only is this illustration is not only trying to show or document a crisis sort of situation, but also get at a potential way to address the situation through the introduction of renewable and resilient energy on critical facilities, which is what city buildings largely are. So what I've gone through with these maps, and I guess a really important point is the reason why I wanted to talk about where the spatial distribution of our members are is, majority of our members are either sited immediately within or adjacent to an SMIA and its buffer zone, right? So what exactly do we do with all this information in terms of practice? One of the things we do is we're sort of basically like a research and policy advocacy shop for the movement. We document these ways of seeing the urban environment, which are fundamentally informed by the practical and experiential local knowledge of our members and the communities they serve. We document it in these annual reports that we release called as part of an initiative called the Climate Justice Agenda, where we show what the environmental vulnerabilities are, what the disproportionate impacts are for communities of color and low-income communities that we serve, and how to address solutions. So we provide recommendations to city and state governments, all levels of governance, in fact, in terms of the design of policies, regulations, programs, initiatives that can get at addressing these environmental vulnerabilities and disproportionate impacts. So these are the first two that we released. And we also do other forms of practice too. So these reports, we actually consult with the city on these. We show them drafts of criticisms of them to make sure that all of our criticisms are accurate before we publicly release them. And in terms of how to facilitate transformation, Chantal Mouffe talks a lot about this idea of agonism, where we should celebrate conflict. And an interesting facet of this work is when we talk to city employees and bureaucrats on the inside, a lot of them say, we need this. It's essential to provide external pressure to show that there's popular support for these types of movements, these types of initiatives that we can then, be champions of internally to try and move things internally. So it's a form of practice there. Another form of practice that we do, is the technical term is shut shit down. And here's an example of that. We led a protest of 5,000 people on the 5th anniversary of Sandy, demanding a variety of different approaches to addressing the climate crisis, targeting Senator Schumer, Governor Cuomo, and Mayor de Blasio. This is just to let you know that in April we released our 2018 version of the Climate Justice Agenda. It's available on our website. Now, to get more into the weeds around energy. So the reason why I want to start off with storm surges and all of the compounding forms of environmental vulnerability is that we have to approach addressing the crisis in cities in a way in which we recognize that you can't approach the problem through a particular sector necessarily. Whatever intervention you provide falls upon a complex ecology of interrelated environmental conditions, social conditions, economic, etc., and the ideologies that sustain those conditions materially, right? So with that in mind, I'll just add a few additional facts that weren't demonstrated through the images that I just provided. So to begin with, the energy sector contributes to upwards of 200,000 excess deaths, so deaths that wouldn't happen. Excess deaths is the public health operative term for if a thing is there, it causes these deaths, and if the thing wasn't there, then those people would still be alive. So 200,000 people in the United States are wiped off the map each year because of our energy sector. How that's distributed geographically, New York is close to 4,000, which is the third highest of all the states in the country. And of those 4,000 in New York State, more than half are in New York City. New York City has the highest number of deaths, excess deaths attributed to the energy sector of any large city in the country, right? How that reality is racialized, 6 to 7 out of 10 people of color live in close enough proximity to a power plant where negative health outcomes can be attributable to patterns of morbidity and mortality in those communities. When we talk about economic burdens of the traditional fossil fuel-based economy, so energy burden is this concept where basically the proportion of your income that goes towards paying your utility bills, low-income communities and communities of color pay a disproportionate amount of their income in order to keep the lights on, in order to keep their refrigerators working and other essential utilities in the household. It is estimated, according to the NAACP and the Association for Blacks in Energy, that African Americans alone contribute as customers, ratepayers, upwards of $40 billion every year into the energy industry. At the same time, African Americans only have access to 1.1% of jobs from this multi-billion-dollar industry and 0.01% of revenues generated from this multi-billion-dollar industry. So these are, again, some of these social and economic conditions that fall upon the communities that deal with the built environmental realities that I conveyed in the maps that I've previously shown. So, Ashley mentioned reforming the energy vision earlier, and how the discourse is constituted around REV right now is all about this clean energy transition, this unprecedented clean energy transition where we are going to redesign regulatory and market conditions in order to facilitate the unprecedented uptake of clean and renewable energy. But what this doesn't get at is the historical patterns, distributions, and legacies of oppression, exclusion, extraction that I have tried to convey in the past few minutes. So what we've been pushing for, harnessing from the perceived momentum of the REV and all of its talking points, is pushing for what we're calling a just transition to a regenerative economy. So it's not simply just a transition, but a just transition. Now, what are some of the challenges to that? It's important for folks across disciplines who are looking at the climate crisis is to really document how emerging and nascent economies related to like the perceived solutions to the climate crisis reproduce the same forms of economic oppression and exclusion rooted in other more traditional and conventional economic sectors. So if you look at the clean energy industry, for example, I just showed you problems with the traditional fossil fuel-based industry. The clean energy industry, I don't have the facts up here, I apologize, but these facts are with the, you can find them on the website of this organization called the Solar Foundation. Over half of all people of color in the solar industry are deeply dissatisfied with their job experiences, feel that they are underpaid, and do not have clear ladders towards job growth. People of color and excuse me, and women, especially women of color, are grossly underrepresented in this sector. And we have an interesting issue because one of the primary impediments to the growth of the solar industry, which is already by itself employing more people than oil, gas, and nuclear combined, and coal, sorry. The main impediment to its growth is the lack of skilled workers. So you have a gross underrepresentation of major segments of society that have been disproportionately burdened by the energy sector for far too long, and you also have a lack of qualified workers in the sector in order that is seen as the primary, facilitator of solutions. So why don't we just fit the puzzle together? For some reason, people don't seem to understand how that's a really viable and compelling sort of solution and approach to the problem. So how are we trying to address both the shortcomings in the emerging clean energy and renewable energy industry, as well as the long time burdens and forms of oppression rooted in the fossil fuel-based economy? We're all over the place, but I'm going to talk about 4 ways we're trying to do that through various interventions. The first is community ownership of distributed energy resources, particularly community solar, through the democratic and community-based ownership of actual infrastructure, actual energy assets. We hope to ensure that the potential revenue generated from these projects can be captured and redistributed equitably and locally. So the title of my presentation was Achieving Racial and Economic Justice Through Energy. And I think it's important to understand that as an epistemic framework. Energy, the apparatus of energy, the actual material infrastructure, the economic processes that build the infrastructure, the ideologies that manifest that infrastructure, how it's constituted spatially, who gets the benefits from it. That apparatus is a site of political struggle, and through that apparatus we can achieve a variety of forms of justice and equity according to principles that we've long fought for as priorities to how we understand these systems. So it's interesting, some of our members approach community ownership of energy as an anti-gentrification strategy, because if you own the asset, you get reinvestments in the community to the people who need them most in order to maintain affordability and cost of living realities in gentrifying neighborhoods. And you also have ownership and decision-making power over who gets employed to maintain those systems, who gets the benefits of the electrons produced from those systems, etc., right? The second is inclusive financing, which is a financing model that can unlock capital in ways, that can deploy capital in ways that have not been deployed before, that can reach market segments, the communities that we serve that have long been disinvested in. Grammar is not my thing. Supply hubs for regional resiliency needs. So Ashley had mentioned, this is not just a conversation about solar. We're also talking about large-scale renewables, right? And the way we see, I'm not going to go back, but the way we see our SMIAs, these significant maritime industrial areas, are not just places where there's a lot of bad vulnerabilities and serious issues that have to be addressed, but the industrial character of these areas also pose a potential as well. Now, we want industrial retention, but we would rather the communities that we serve in these areas to have access to jobs in renewable and clean energy. SMIAs could be hubs that can manufacture and supply the entire region's resiliency needs. So where do offshore wind turbines get built, get staged, get assembled? The port potential for that type of renewable energy infrastructure, the type of large-scale renewable energy infrastructure we're talking about, that port potential is in New York City's SMIAs. So how about we re-envision these places not as prime sites for luxury development or ongoing hazardous industries, but as sites for, that can serve the region's resiliency needs through the manufacturing and supply of the technologies we associated with what those resiliency needs are, right? And finally, we're trying to design projects that explicitly target some of the dirtiest, polluting, inefficient, and oldest power plants in New York State, and those are located in New York City in the communities we serve, or immediately next to. So just really quick, in terms of community ownership, we have a partnership called Revitalize. As you can see, REV is capitalized. That's our cute spin on Rev. My primary responsibility with NEJA as energy planners to coordinate this partnership. It's a partnership of environmental justice organizations throughout the state. So two organizations are members of NEJA, Uprose and Sunset Park, the Point Community Development Corporation in Hunts Point in the South Bronx, as well as People United for Sustainable Housing Buffalo, which is based in West Buffalo. I coordinate this partnership, which is focused on developing community-owned and controlled renewable energy infrastructure in the three areas that I just said, Sunset Park, Hunts Point, West Buffalo. And in that capacity, we are also providing input on the designs of policies and programs at the state level that can help facilitate the establishment of similar projects in communities like ours, or like the ones that we serve. This is kind of a boring slide, so I thought I'd put an image attached to it. You can see from the graph by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, if you have local ownership of a renewable energy asset, it has it does leaps and bounds in terms of local employment as well as local economic growth. And our primary approach to this is community solar, which is different from your conventional solar, which is on a property like a standalone home's rooftop. A community solar project is shown in this image, but we're running out of time, so I can talk about it in the discussion portion if you all want to know more about what community solar is and how it's different from conventional solar. Oh, the image is not showing. Okay, that's weird. There was a image of what pay-as-you-save is, but we're in the area that I showed you that's experiencing an energy shortfall. Con Edison got over $100 million of ratepayer money, our money, to design solutions to that shortfall that wouldn't include the construction of added large-scale infrastructure. So what these are called are non-wires alternatives, demand-side reduction programs, which is basically reduce the overall energy demand in this area so you don't have to build a huge substation that would cost billions. But with that money, they've done a lot of interesting things when it comes to commercial and industrial entities, but when it comes to residential programming, they spent millions and millions of dollars to design what was essentially a light bulb replacement program, right? Now, the housing stock we're talking about in this area, East New York, Crown Heights, Bedford-Stuyvesant, primarily communities of color that were disinvested, beginning with redlining. We're talking about old housing stock in desperate need of repairs, refurbishing, weatherization in one of the city's most heat-vulnerable areas. If you just take heat-related mortality and projections for heat-related mortality in New York City, if you use it as a standalone category of mortality, it would be the third highest killer in New York City, according to projections, which are over 3,300 people dying from heat each year by 2050, I believe. So it's a major killer in an area of the city that hasn't had meaningful resources to address its housing and building stock for decades. We were trying to ask Con Edison to use their hundreds of millions of dollars, not all of it, just a portion of it, to pilot a small portion, like 5 maybe, to pilot what would be a self-sustaining financial mechanism by which deep energy efficiency retrofits can finally reach low-income communities, underserved market segments by the existing energy efficiency economy, right? It's been a nightmare because utility business models are close to a century old. The energy grid is the largest man-made machine in human history. It's already very old, and you have business models aimed at administering and stewarding this big-ass machine, another technical term, business models that are also equally as old, right? And these models need to transform in the disruptive ways, innovative ways, creative ways that can really get at reforming this massive infrastructure in order, and transforming this massive infrastructure in order to address the crisis that we're in, right? But the traction around this is very difficult. It's very difficult to get utilities to think in these terms because they think in very narrow logics, right? Oh, there it is, sorry. We can get into it in discussion. And again, large-scale renewables, how can we identify, environmental justice communities with industrial characteristics, not as just sites of problems, but as the forefront of solutions, right? And Sunset Park, this is an op-ed that was written by Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, who's the executive director of UPROSE, one of our members, and Angela Adrar, who's the executive director of the Climate Justice Alliance, which is basically the national version of our alliance. So the national version of a national alliance of grassroots organizations from frontline communities across the country, and they focus more on national level issues, policy, and deal with the federal government, whereas we deal with city and state. Thinking about how the industrial potential of a lot of these communities can help facilitate the resiliency needs we require, as well as addressing, the needs for jobs, the maintenance of living wages and affordability in communities that are being cited for luxury developments like Sunset Park, maintaining the industrial character so that we can also clamp down on gentrification and ensure that long-term residents have access to exercising leadership in this new type of economy that we want to develop. Finally, this is a terrible map because it comes from New York State, but it's a map the pins are all peaker plants, which are some of the dirtiest and inefficient forms of power plant that we have in the country. They only turn on when the conventional power plants are not producing enough energy to meet the demands of the people in the utility service area. So that means like days when it's really hot or really cold and we need more energy to power heaters or air conditioning, etc. So on extreme heat days where our communities are most vulnerable, you're gonna turn on some of the most polluting infrastructure in the state. Right? So not only is there a chronic exposure to air pollution, but you're going to make it acutely worse on the days where people need the most help, right? So we're involved in what the state has embarked on, which is this initiative called the New York State Energy Storage Roadmap, which is trying to bring 1,500 megawatts of battery storage infrastructure to New York, I think by 2025 or 2030. I don't know. Something like that. All the numbers kind of blend together. I apologize for that. But we're trying to ensure that, again, with this initiative, we prioritize projects that explicitly displace the need for generation from these dirty facilities, while also bringing resilient and backup power in these communities as well. I guess just to take away from all this, you all can read, right? So I don't have to read it out loud. But we have a crisis that is compounded upon historic legacies and patterns that need to be addressed. So whatever intervention or solution that is presented, it has to be designed in a way that reflects the complexity and nuance of the ecological, both political and material, ecologies that I've tried to illustrate with some of these slides. Additionally, I think a lot of times, especially in academia, no offense, but also across sectors, big greens, there's this valorization of local knowledge and embracing and prioritizing local knowledge. Now, while that's true, NEJA, my alliance, is sort of a case study in how you do that, right? And how to utilize different forms of knowledge production and different forms of urban practice to facilitate the types of built environmental conditions, political and economic conditions, ecological conditions that we want to see, right? Our board consists of staff from each of our member organizations. So our alliance, the direction our alliance takes, it's all based on the leadership of the very members that we serve. And the different types of knowledge production that we are engaged in are accountable to the communities that we serve. So while I showed you a bunch of complex GIS maps, that comes from the reality that when we speak truth to power, power is not multilingual and does not take the daily practical and lived experiences of low-income communities of color seriously. You need to approach it through a particular type of empirical knowledge production. And that's where those maps come in and the data comes in. But at the same time, we're accountable to our communities and we have to speak in a language that's accessible to them as well. And that also includes shutting shit down. And yeah, that's it. Sorry if I went over time.